Hi, welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined by Trevin Wax. Trevin is Vice President of Research and Resource Development at the North American Mission Board and a visiting professor at Wheaton College. A former missionary to Romania, Trevin's a regular columnist at the Gospel Coalition, and he's contributed to the Washington Post, Religion News Service, World Christianity Today. He is the author of multiple books, including The Multi-Directional Leader, Rethink the Self, This Is Our Time, Eschatological Discipleship, and Gospel-Centered Teaching. He and his wife, Karina, have 3 children. You can follow him on Twitter, on Facebook, and you can receive his columns via email. So just to begin today then, Trevin, if we may, can you tell us a little bit about your background and some of the key events in your life that helped to form you and your love for Christ and his church?
Sure, Mark. So I grew up going to church as long as I can remember. My parents were part of an independent Baptist church, which was in the South in the United States. I grew up there. I learned very quickly there the essentials of the gospel. I understood at a very young age that I was a sinner in need of a savior, and I wanted to devote my life to Christ. As the years went by, the more you grow into that understanding and that belief. And by the time I was a teenager, we were at a different church. We were helping. We were part of a church plant, a Southern Baptist church plant in the southeastern part of the United States, and it was there that I really felt my spiritual life come alive, to the things of God. I knew I was a believer already, but it was there that some of the things I knew in my head and that I held in my heart just became more and more real to me. And so it was in that experience that I really began to study the scriptures on my own, to want to know God more, to want to know His people more, to have an interest in theology and how theology shapes our culture and things like that. Around the same time as that was happening, I took my first mission trip to an Eastern European country, to Romania, and did mission trips there over an extended number of years, and then moved there as a 19-year-old. And I did college there. I went to a Christian university and was there. Met my wife there. We had our first son during those years that we lived there. And so that was a very formative experience as well, because it was cross-cultural ministry. It allowed me to look at my culture from the outside in. And I sensed, a call to some kind of ministry over the years. And so that was the beginning of that, and really set the stage for me to begin writing, to begin serving in different places that the Lord has opened doors over the years.
Thank God for that. And then were there any persons along that journey who were especially inspirational or influential that you'd like to tell us about?
I think it's always interesting to a lot of times when people are asked about big influences that they have in their life, they think of, well-known church leaders and pastors, people with major platforms who have written many books and whatnot. And I can definitely name some of those who I think have been influential. I think from a theological perspective and sort of an overarching shape to how I engage in the task of theology and things, I point to people like John Stott and others who, through their books and writings have been something of a mentor to me. But when you ask the question about church leaders, I go back to those who have been closest to me personally. So, I think of the pastor whose teaching I sat under for a decade, 2, sometimes 3 times a week, who I probably heard deliver more than 1,000 talks and sermons, and the Christ-centered approach that he came to the scriptures with, the way that he was able to unpack and apply the scriptures in a really beautiful way. Or I think of the pastor that I served alongside in a rural church in Tennessee for several years, who really loved his people and showed me what it's like to, make the rounds and visit people in the hospital and be with people, with families in grief after they've lost a loved one and things like that. And so my mind goes back to when I think about those who have made the biggest impression. I can name off some names of people that I've read a lot of who have influenced my thinking, but I think I'd be remiss to not mention those who have been closest to me in ministry and who have really poured into me and who I've seen by way of example be faithful in the task.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Trevin. And today I want to focus mainly on some of your books. And I know you most familiarly from reading your work, but even then it comes across that balance of pastoral spirit along with an academic side. So I appreciate that about your work. So just to begin, if we might, I'd love to speak about This Is Our Time, which I thought was a wonderful book. So, what did you then hope to accomplish with that work, and how is it different from maybe some of the other books on the self out there?
Sure. I think This Is Our Time was, I mean, to to make the joke of a timely book in the sense that my goal with it was to to catch something of to give people a glimpse of the cultural moment that we're currently experiencing, and to ask the question of what faithfulness looks like in the time that we're living. It's interesting. The book "This Is Our Time" came out a year before a more academic book called Eschatological Discipleship, but I had done most of the work on eschatological discipleship a year before I wrote "This Is Our Time." And I had already done a lot of this academic sort of a deep dive into why do we think the way we do? How do we view time? How do we view our current moment, our era? What does faithfulness look like? I had done a lot of that research at a very deep level, really digging down into the currents of the Enlightenment and the sexual revolution and consumerism and its impact on our understanding of faith. I had done a lot of that, but I thought, okay, what I really want to do is to take all of that top shelf academic type of work and to really translate that down using illustrations and stories and analogies and to put it in a way that was more accessible, to treat some of those topics in a way that anyone could pick up the book and read it and find it interesting. And so the result was This Is Our Time. And I think the most important thing about the book, I mean, it does hit on various topics, everything from the how we view social media and technology and the phone, and how we how we engage the entertainment world, or our view of sex, our view of marriage, our view of finances, and how we are as consumers, our view of our engagement into politics and things like that. All throughout that book, each chapter is sort of taking another snapshot of our current cultural moment and asking the question, what does it look like for us to be faithful in this time? But I think the important thing about that book overall is the construct at the beginning of recognizing that in every cultural myth, so to speak, every narrative that takes root in people's hearts, that gives meaning and significance to people's lives, there's always, if you look very carefully, you will find some aspect of the truth in that narrative, in that myth, because there's something deep, there's some kind of human longing that is driving people to believe in that myth, whether it's the idea that making more money and rising up in your career is the way to happiness, or whatever it might be. There's some longing that is true and real and beautiful there. But then, because this is not the gospel, there's always a lie as well. There's always a place where the gospel is going to bring a word of confrontation to that narrative or that myth. And then, so what I'm trying to do in the book is to examine these different spheres of life, these different moments in our time, snapshots of our cultural moment, if you will. And my goal throughout the book is to ask the question, okay, what is the true and right longing here? What is the lie here? And then if I bring the light of the gospel to this, how can I bring the gospel to bear in such a way that it exposes the lie, but also fulfills the deeper longing? I find that a lot of times Christians will rush to just talking about how the gospel fulfills all of our longings without really that sharp edge of critique and confrontation. While there are other Christians, I think, that are all about showing how Christianity is true and how everything else is false and how all of these myths are going to lead you astray, without really connecting that back to the longing for why people would want that myth or that lie to be true in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so what I was trying to do in the book was to provide a model of how to do this in a way that would be engaging and accessible to people trying to figure out our cultural context and what faithfulness looks like in this moment.
Brilliant. Thank you, Trevin. And I think you did that excellent. Like, you did an excellent job in a number of areas. I want to just start off with one that you mentioned there, the phone, for example, and this modern technology. What's at the heart of this phones kind of hold over us, and how might we then resist that power along those lines that you just mentioned?
Well, I think the primary reason that the phone has such a hold over us is because it constantly puts us at the center of the universe, and there's no place that humans like to be better than be the center of our own universe, right? To have the world revolving around us. I mean, with the phone, you really do have a world revolving around you at all times. Sending you notifications, or it's completely tailored to your preferences. You have the apps, you have the ability to do whatever you want on the phone at virtually any time. And so it's a phone in which we really are the maker and shaper of that experience in a way that is very, very compelling, but alas is also very, very addicting. And so I think the primary reason that the phone is so appealing is that it attracts that tendency that we all have, that default setting of the human heart to be the center and be all of all things. So I think that's the first reason. But since the phone has now come now for most of us, the phone and the idea of like social media is kind of all together, because we're on our phone. When we're on our phones, we're on social media. We remain connected. Because of that, there is this insatiable desire, this appetite, this hunger that we have to know, to not want to miss out on knowing what we need to know, to know the breaking news as soon as it happens, or to be constantly aware of what's going on in the lives of our friends and families, to be just in the know immediately. And if there is anything you need to look up, you can Google whatever you need. You find so much online so quickly. So there's this thirst for knowledge, but then the social media and the expressive aspect of that leads to this thirst for others to know us. So there's this desire to be known as well, that others would see us, that they would see our display, and that they would applaud us or give us likes or comments or feedback or whatever it is that would give us that rush that we've been seen, and that we are standing out, and that we're somehow getting a reaction or response. And over time, that cycle begins to work in ways that are really unhealthy. And I think there have been some other books that have come out even since This Is Our Time released that I think demonstrate how some of the mental health challenges that have arisen because of too much time spent on the phone, or too much time in that sort of constant connection without any break. That's another a thing that's been detrimental to a lot of teenage girls, for instance. Some of the research is showing. So I think that's some of what's feeding that hunger and that desire for being on our phones constantly. And we have to, I think, deliberately set up in our lives aspects and elements of discipline and discernment to prevent ourselves from being overtaken by some of our more selfish tendencies in that area. I think we for some, it may mean putting aside the phone completely. For others, it may be having it only available at certain times. For some, it may be taking off all of notifications and apps from your phone completely to take some sort of semblance of normality back. We have to resist this pull into shallowness and superficiality, and we will need to adopt different disciplines that will work for us in order to do so.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks for that, Trevin. And I think another facet of your work is dealing at things like happiness at different levels. So I just wanted to ask you, tied to that, what's wrong with this pursuit of happiness as it's commonly understood? And maybe what does happiness look like then from more Christian eyes?
Yeah, the question of happiness, I knew when I was writing This Is Our Time, I devoted a whole chapter called this question of the pursuit of happiness, knowing that one of my future books would be devoted only to that subject. And that's exactly what happened. In some ways, the smaller book that came a couple of years later, Rethink Yourself, is an extended application and an extension of that chapter in This Is Our Time that is on happiness. The pursuit of happiness is not wrong. The pursuit of joy is not wrong. I agree with with Christian teaching that would say that we are We are made to find our happiness in God. As St. Augustine said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, Lord. So I believe that there is a restlessness that is put in the human heart that is an important factor in our search for God, one of the driving motivators for our search for God. Where we go astray today, I think, is in this understanding of happiness as if it is a path that we must discover for ourselves and define for ourselves, that we are the definers of our happiness, that we are the ones who, if happiness is our destiny, it's only our destiny because we are the ones who know what will bring us happiness, and then we actually pursue it with all of our might. The problem with this approach is we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. We often don't know what will bring us happiness. And it doesn't matter. It seems like we don't get this. No matter how many times, we see people who have lived their whole life in pursuit of some goal or some dream and finally achieved it, and yet still come up empty inside and say that they're still unfulfilled. A lot of times, we have these slogans and sayings of, be true to yourself and follow your heart and chase your dream. But, sometimes your dream isn't big enough for what God actually wants for you. Sometimes your heart will deceive you and you'll chase something that doesn't bring fulfillment or the happiness that you thought it would. And so the problem with the pursuit of happiness, as we commonly understand it, is that we, number one, assume that we know what's going to make us happy. And then number two, think that happiness will be found in something other than God. And it's just impossible. It won't be. We will never be happy apart from God. We will never know true joy apart from the one who made us, who understands how we were made, and the shape of our hearts that only He is meant to fill. This doesn't mean that there won't be periods of comfort, perhaps, some periods of satisfaction, maybe fleeting moments of happiness, but the true joy and happiness, the sort of restfulness that our restless hearts are pushing for, the kind of enduring joy that we would hope for, is only possible through relationship to the one who made us and who put that desire in our hearts.
Amen. I think tied to that point, then I wanted to ask you about our sense of cultural homelessness, which I think is really what you're speaking about. And what do you think is behind that cultural homelessness, and how does the Bible then describe home and its importance in more theological terms?
Well, I think one reason that we feel homeless is because G.K. Chesterton has this great line about in Orthodoxy, where he explains that Christianity helped him to understand how he could feel homesick at home, in the sense of that to be homesick at home would give you the impression that even though you are at the place of rest, the place that you wanted to be, there's still something that your sense of home is actually drawing you towards, something that's even greater, a greater home. I think the reason we feel culturally homeless a lot of times is because we should, as Christians. This world is both our home and not our home. That's why we sing songs like "This world is not my home, I'm just passing through," and we also sing hymns like "This is my Father's world." Oh, let me never forget that though the wrongs seem oft strong, God is the ruler yet. There's this sort of paradoxical understanding of the Christian's understanding of the world. And the reason why we feel culturally homeless is because we are at home in the world that God created for us. This is the world that God placed, the first humans in, the garden to work it and to cultivate it and to live in a way that would bring Him glory, and to make something of this world that we find ourselves in. So there's a sense in which, yes, earth is our home, but because this world is fallen, there is also this feeling of dislocation, that things are not the way they're supposed to be. And because of that, we rightly have a feeling of alienation, of homelessness in the very place that we are to be. And so I think what the scriptures do is they give us categories to understand that. They give us a framework for understanding where that feeling comes from. But even more than that, the gospel gives us hope that that's not the final answer, that this sense of cultural homelessness will not be with us forever, but that we will wind up at some point, once Jesus returns and makes all things new, once heaven and earth are together, like the new Jerusalem coming out of heaven, like a bride adorned for the groom. Once heaven and earth are married and are one again, so to speak, then we will know that joy and that feeling of being at home that we were always meant to feel before sin entered the world and altered that experience. So that sense of cultural homelessness is a good thing because it points us to our true and eternal home. At the same time, we should say that if we don't feel that cultural homelessness, if we don't feel like if we feel like we just completely belong here, we should ask the question if we're really being as faithful as we think we are as Christians. Because if this world is all where we have our hope, if we feel completely at home here, where the fallenness of the world doesn't break our hearts, doesn't have an effect on us, then that begs the question as to whether or not we really have whether or not we're really living into our calling as people who should feel both at home and not at home in this world.
Amen. And I think one incarnate example of what you're talking about that you have referenced may be marriage. So I wanted to ask you about marriage and what role it plays in maybe resisting some of the more secularist myths that maybe dominate over the Christian society and restoring this Christian polis and some of the maybe benefits for individuals and for the society that come with that.
Well, that's a fantastic question. We're watching in an increasingly individualized, atomistic worldview in Western societies, the decrease and the dissolution of many marriages. Dissolution meaning many are involved in serial marriages, of course, with multiple divorces or things, or many not getting married at all, deciding that they don't need the certificate of marriage, they don't need the government recognition of marriage, and simply, living together. And then, of course, the whole redefinitions of marriage that are happening, whether it be between 2 and 3 and more partners for polyamorous relationships, or whether it be, same-sex marriage and whatnot. So there has been a very important shift in the last century in our understanding of marriage that has massive ramifications for the nature of the family, for the nature of our assumptions, and that has, of course, given rise to all sorts of additional questions related to how we conceive of our identity, the relationship between biological sex and gender and things like that. I do think that marriage in the Christian worldview is vitally important because for several reasons. One, it's the scriptures give us marriage as a picture of Christ and his church. So there is there's a sense in which marriage is a signifier, rightly understood, is a signifier of the gospel, of Christ's commitment to his people. That is the starting point. In fact, marriage is such a deep reality that actually points to a deeper reality. It's a signpost pointing to something that's far greater than we can even imagine. And it gives us a sign of the gospel. It's no wonder that the evil one would go after marriage as a target, because if there's a way to alter, distort, or destroy that painting, that beautiful portrait, you lose this aspect of the glory of the gospel. So I think that's the place we must start, is with the story of redemption. And we see in scriptures, for example, marriage at the beginning and at the end. So it is a vitally important part of our understanding of the scriptures. So we must start there. But there are also, just from a Christian perspective, from a sanctifying perspective, marriage plays a sanctifying role. You put two sinners together and they are going to rub each other the wrong way and have fights and arguments and challenges, and God often places us in relationships where not everything is smooth and easy all the time, because we need the benefits and the challenges that come from being with people unlike ourselves, being committed to people, being committed to someone who you might not have you might be having struggles with, or where I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who in a homily delivered at a wedding was the one who said, right now your love has led you to the vow, but from this point on, your vow will be what sustains your love. So there is that sanctifying work that happens in marriage. But then there's also the public ramifications of marriage. We in the West, we tend to think of marriage as a private thing, an individualistic thing, where it's really just the government bestowing approval on two romantically involved consenting adults. That's all that's really there. That's all that's really at stake. Historically, this is very abnormal, very unusual. The whole reason that government has been in the recognizing of marriage, in the business of recognizing marriage from the beginning, has been because of the procreative element of marriage. The fact that this is the only relationship, male and female, this is the only relationship that actually perpetuates the species, that actually brings about, through fruitfulness, the possibility of new life. There are all sorts of other kinds of romantic entanglements and relationships and that are out there, but this is the one that is important publicly for the future of a nation, for the future of society. And yet that public understanding of marriage seems to have so decreased now that we really don't think of it in those terms as we once did, as we used to. So I think one of the challenges that we have as Christians that we face will be the need to rebuild a marriage culture, a healthy marriage culture that avoids some of the excesses of our current moment that would lead us to that individualistic, privatized understanding of marriage as a contractual romantic relationship between two consenting adults, to something grander, to something bigger. And that's going to take a lot of work. We are going to be involved in this for our entire lives. We will no longer be able to explain to our children and our children's children, we cannot expect them to merely assume that just because they've grown up in a world or their church says something about what marriage is or whatnot, that is an assumption that you can take for granted. We will have to explain not only what we believe about marriage, but why it's important and how we live with those with very different understandings of marriage at the same time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Trevin. So if we might move on then to eschatological discipleship, which you mentioned previously, I want to ask you a bit more about that, as you've hinted at a few times, the importance of thinking of our ultimate destination in the new heaven and new earth, and ask you, what is eschatological discipleship, and what are we missing, maybe even when many of us do attend to this neglected facet of Christian living? Even when we do attend to discipleship, that is, we still maybe don't put the pieces together.
Yeah, the whole question of eschatological discipleship for me was raised by a lot of different studies that I had done, and with different scholars who were teasing out the implications of a Christian worldview or a Christian social imaginary, trying to understand better what it means for us to live as faithful believers in the world that God has called us to. And, there are different, very typical worldview questions that we all have answers to, whether we realize them or not. Questions like, who are we? Where did we come from? I'm interested also in the question of, what's gone wrong with the world, things like that. I was intrigued by an additional worldview question that was proposed by N.T. Wright a couple of decades ago, actually, where he said if you were to add a worldview question to some of his earlier work, he says the question would be, what time is it? Because in order for people to know how to act in the world, they have to have an internal clock of some sort, an internal calendar of where they've been and where the world is going. And I think that's absolutely true, because the Bible does not give us a timeless set of moral instructions. Now, there are moral instructions that have a timeless import about them. Don't get me wrong. I mean, think of the 10 Commandments. But notice that when we talk about the 10 Commandments, there are 10. There's not 1,000, right? even the guidelines that we find in the Old Testament law, or even in if you want to take the law of Christ, is, in the instructions and the exhortations that we read in the New Testament letters. The challenge here is that there is no one rule that fits every single situation of how to apply. I mean, obviously you have your very clear, you don't do this and you must do that, right? But even then, when Paul says, you must live this way, you must be generous, or you must do this, he doesn't spell out all of the specifics. The question that must be raised is, okay, what does, for example, the virtue of discipleship, the virtue of generosity, what does that look like in my particular context, in my particular place and time? And so I think we already asked this question. We already asked the place question whenever we send missionaries to other places. We expect them to know something about the culture they're going into, so that they are able to apply the truth of Christianity in that particular place in a way that it will take root in a contextualized way, in a way that makes sense for that particular culture, in a way that will both critique and challenge at times that culture, but also affirm certain aspects of that culture. That's what we expect missionaries to do. But it's not just a question about space. I believe, in the point I make in eschatological discipleship, it's also a question about time. And it's not, my point is not that we are going to be changing our moral calculus generation after generation. It's to recognize that we are not just embodied people in a place, but we are also people facing choices in a particular moment in history. And it takes wisdom to know exactly how to act. It's not a hard, fast rule that comes down from on high for every particular situation most of the time. It is often wisdom in applying the principles that we see in Scripture. And so if I were to define eschatological discipleship in some way, I would want to say that discipleship is a way of is a type of spiritual formation that involves wisdom in this contemporary setting that we find ourselves in, and calls us to a contextualized obedience as a way of showing that the biblical account of the world's past, present, and future is true. That's the most important thing. And I would just add one last thing to that. So it's not only wisdom about how to live in this present moment, it's also about wisdom in how to counter rival conceptions of time and progress that are being offered out there in the world. I think that is the key to eschatological discipleship and to answering that question that comes from N.T. Wright as to what time it is as a worldview question.
Marvelous. Thank you, Trevin. And can you give us maybe one or two examples that we have from the Old Testament that you're keen to remind us of?
Well, one of the places that that I immediately go to, this is a popular one for a lot of worldview scholars, people that like the terminology of worldview. I know there's some debate about whether even that's helpful terminology, if it's too intellectual and not as connected as much as we ought to be to sort of our embodiedness and our practices and rituals that have a big impact on our spiritual formation. But the that's often gone to is the sons of Issachar in First Chronicles chapter 12. There's a reference there to the sons of Issachar. It's a very quiet, very quick reference, but it just says that the sons of Issachar were men who understood the times and therefore knew what Israel should do. And so, if you want to apply that if you're looking at it at that particular moment, they knew the future was with David. He was the shepherd boy turned warrior. He had already been anointed king over Israel, but he had not ascended to the throne yet. So they were in a time between the times, not unlike we as Christians today recognize that Christ has been exalted as Lord and King of the world, and yet his ascension and his throne, his lordship has not been made visible for all to see yet at the end of time. So we too live in a time between the times when the kingdom has already come and is not yet here fully. But because the sons of Issachar knew the time they were in, they they knew what they should do. Another example in the Old Testament would be, the wisdom literature. Obviously, if you're looking at the Proverbs and whatnot, you're seeing this element of wisdom that is not giving you a one size fits all rule, but is trying to instill in us the kind of understanding of our current, so that we are able to be discerning, and we are able to display wisdom faithfully. And so I think that's a key thing that we should consider as well, as the wisdom literature is a good example of what eschatological discipleship looks like in the Old Testament.
Fantastic. Thank you, Trevin. And can you give us then one or two examples from the Gospels or from Acts?
Well, I am someone who loves the parables, and so I typically I like to go to the parables because I find the stories of Jesus to be so fascinating on so many different levels. But the very fact that Jesus told stories rather than simply laying out in propositional ways all of the things that he wanted to say is a demonstration of this, of the point I'm making, that the story helps alter your understanding of the world in ways that will then change your actions in the world. So, to give an example of the wise and the foolish builders, this is an example of a wise man who is prepared for the storms that are going to come and is living in such a way. Jesus says that the wise man is like those who build their house on the rock. Those are the ones who listen and obey his teaching. So there is a dimension to this of recognizing that eschatological judgment is on the horizon, that God is just, as we confess with the Apostles' Creed, that Christ will come again to judge the living and the dead. We believe this, and so we must alter our lives accordingly. That is something that you find in multiple of the parables. I mean, for example, the wise and foolish builders, the foolish bridesmaids. You think parables with an eschatological focus. I think of the rich fool in the Gospel of Luke. These are important ways in which Jesus tells stories that are not just sort of timeless stories that we can point to and say, isn't there a good moral lesson from this? But the whole point of him telling the story is so that we inhabit that story. We enter into that story, and it changes our mindset and our hearts and our formation in such a way that we are then later on able to better understand the moment that we're in. And what I could throw out, it would be the Good Samaritan. I mean, Jesus could have simply said, if you want to be a good neighbor, help the one who's in need. But instead, he gives us this fascinating multi-layered story of the Good Samaritan in order to challenge our entire understanding of what being a neighbor is, who our neighbor is, what neighbor love looks like. That is a much more, a much richer and more compelling way of thinking about how we fulfill Christ's command to love our neighbors in the world once we take that story and we enter into it and let it shape our hearts and our minds.
Amen. And something you mentioned before there, Trevin, was these rival eschatologies. I want to ask you maybe what are some of the main ones in our English-speaking world, at least, and how do they contrast with the biblical picture?
Well, in order to talk about rival eschatologies, we have to back up and recognize that the word eschatology doesn't simply mean the end times. A lot of Christians assume that eschatology simply refers to the back of the systematic theology textbook, in which we address things like the return of Christ, the meaning or the significance of the millennial reign of Christ, and when Christ is coming back and how and what all that will entail, what the future state will be. I'm using a broader definition of eschatology to speak of the whole sort of scope of Christian understanding of time and eternity, where we've been and where we're going, where we are in this current moment, because we know what the future is going to hold. Not the specifics of that end times eschatology, but I'm using it in that broader sense. But I'm actually doing something even more. I'm broadening out a bit more as well to eschatologists being Christian, saying that there are other types of eschatology out there, meaning there are views of the world and where the world is headed, so to speak. So the main ones that I'm talking about in the book, I think the biggest one, the most important one that we could deal with is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment certainly has eschatology. It has this understanding that the climactic moment in world history was the time in the 1700s when the light bulb came on, so to speak, and we moved out of the dark ages and the repressive times of religion before us and whatnot, and we moved into an era of science and reason. And we are now on this journey toward bring more and more knowledge so that we can grow in our understanding of the world, our understanding of morality, and eventually arrive at a place of some kind of utopianism. The Enlightenment has this view that that we need to shed the silly superstitions of the past and the religious identities that we've had, and that as progress marches on, we more and more technologically advanced, and the world will get increasingly better over time. This is an optimistic view of human nature. It's also an optimistic view of human history and progress. And we know that the Enlightenment view, with many of its challenges, is powerful simply because if any century in human history should have divested people of the notion that things were going to just get continually and continually better, it should have been the last century. When you think about the number of people dying in communist dictatorships or world wars and things that took place in the last century that outstripped the number of deaths from previous centuries, most all previous centuries combined. And yet it marches on, this idea that we can have a life without God. So I think this is an eschatology in the sense that it portrays this picture of this is the way the world is headed, and you better get on board. And that tends to be very, very persuasive to many people in a more secular society that see at least no public place for conversations about God and his will and his revelation.
Something that I think is also wonderful about your work is the balance between this focus on eschatological discipleship and evangelism. And I think that ties our 2 points together here. I wanted to ask you, what do you hope then that the church might recover in restoring these two and placing them in the proper order together?
Well, I think that the key for effective evangelism, obviously getting the gospel right is effective. I mean, we believe the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, not our particular presentation of the gospel. We rely on the explosiveness of the news itself, not the winsomeness of our own performance in presenting it. So the Bible itself is powerful, and we trust that it's powerful, and that's why we ought to at least want to share it with those who have not heard the good news. What I would say about where eschatological discipleship impacts evangelism is by making us ask the question again: what time is it? What is the best way for the gospel to be heard and received in the era in which we live? Gospel presentations change over time, not because the gospel itself changes, but because the way that people hear the gospel, the way they encounter it, the plausibility structures of society make certain aspects of the gospel appealing and certain aspects of the gospel a stumbling block. You will never remove, if you're preaching the true gospel, you will never remove the appeal, and you will never remove the stumbling block. They both must be there. The question for us when it comes to presenting is, what time is it? What areas of our current cultural moment that make the gospel hard to understand or hard to receive? And then how can we address those challenges? Not in a way that removes the offense of the gospel, because we mustn't do that. That would also remove it of its strangeness and its compelling power. But how do we present the gospel in a way that it is most likely to be able to break through the cultural barriers, break through the cultural noise? C.S. Lewis talked about when writing children's literature or talking about writing fiction, that you sometimes you can you sneak past the watchful dragons, in that you're able to present Christian concepts in ways that are received differently because they come from an unexpected source or in an unexpected way. I think it's important for us as apologists and evangelists to be asking the question ourselves: how can we make sure that we are comprehensible to the society that we're able to reach? And then how can we do the very best we can at being persuasive? Obviously, at the end of the day, the Holy Spirit is the true evangelist, but we are joining him in his work and seeking to be faithful and asking for this particular time and moment, what might be effective?
Fantastic. And what are some of the main evangelical concepts and practices of discipleship that you think are true to the word then? And how do you conclude this book?
I actually, one of my classes at Wheaton is a in fact, the classes that I teach at Wheaton, in both courses, we have an entire segment devoted to evangelistic methods and models. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I like to do is to pull out different kinds of evangelistic methods and for us to review them and to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of them all. I tend to not be one who is going to be overly harsh or critical toward any presentation of the gospel that at least understands the essentials of the faith and leads people to the scriptures and helps them understand their need for Christ and his salvation. Because I believe it was D.L. Moody who, when he was critiqued for his evangelistic methods, says, told someone, I like my method of doing evangelism more than your method of not doing it. Because sometimes we can be more critical of evangelism than we are actually engaging in it. But that said, I do think that there are some techniques and some. One of them is to take an extended amount of time. If you have time with someone who's interested, is walking through a gospel together. Perhaps even the Gospel of Mark or Gospel of John, but going through a gospel over an extended amount of time to where you're studying it together and you're encountering Jesus with someone together. I believe the ministry Christianity Explored does a good job of laying out how this might be done. Another evangelistic presentation that I have found helpful more recently has been one that has been promoted by my own organization that I'm at now, called the North American Mission Board. The evangelistic presentation is called 3 Circles, and it lays out in basically 3 circles. You can explain it on a napkin if you're at a restaurant with someone, but it takes this understanding of God's design, our sin, and our need for redemption, restoration. That God is restoring what has been broken. He's restoring it back to the way it was. What I like about the 3 circles is that it begins with the picture of God's design, what creation is all about. So I found the 3 circles method to be helpful, and one that I tend to go back to. There are many others. I think of one called The Story that I like, which lays out the gospel in terms of the narrative of the Bible from beginning to end to help someone understand the big picture of the Bible, especially if they don't have some of the assumptions or presuppositions of biblical Christianity themselves. But those are just a few that come to mind. I'm sure there are many others that we could point to, some more helpful than others, but no matter what presentation we use, the important thing, I think, is to use them with people who need to hear the good news.
Marvelous. Thank you, Trevin. So there's a number of other books we could have discussed today. Rethink Yourself for the Multidirectional Leader. And I would highly recommend that anybody listening that they would go and read those, because they're most wonderful books. But unfortunately, we'll close up for today. And I wanted to ask you before we do then, is there anything else that you're working on now or that you still feel the passion to get involved with in the future, Trevin?
Well, I am in the throes of another book, actually. I'm working on a book tentatively titled "The Thrill of Orthodoxy," and we're living in very tumultuous times. We're living in an era. The words often get overused, and one of the overused words of our time is unprecedented. Nothing is truly unprecedented if you look back at history, not only of the church but of the world. But certainly we're living in a time where there is a lot of rapid cultural change taking place, a lot of changes that have come with moral shifts in our society, as well as technological advances that have become prevalent, the connectedness of the internet age. And there's so much disinformation out there. There's so many people asking the question of, what can I turn to? Who can I trust? What do I know is true? What do I know is lasting and enduring rather than ephemeral and in passing? I think this is a moment when it would be good for us as Christians to look back in order to move forward, to look back to the foundation of the faith that's been given to us, that we've inherited, not only in the scriptures, but also in the faithfulness of the Christians that have gone before us, who have worked out many of the details that are vitally important for our understanding of doctrine, for our understanding of theology, and in a way that shows that, it may seem appealing and attractive at first to think that the way forward is to continually adapt and adjust and try to tweak or alter the Christian message, when actually the most exciting thing one can do is simply stand, is to stand with the faithful of the ages, recognizing that this is a message that has been passed down. It has been passed down from generation to generation. It has come to us. We have received it, and now we want to pass it down undiluted to the next generation. And I think a firmer grasp of orthodoxy, of what it means to be orthodox in our theology, in our doctrine, in our understanding of the world, and in our obedience. This is the moment in our age when we need to go back to the basics. And so that's one of the things I'm excited about working on, is helping to present a message through a book that hopefully will help people see the beauty and the thrill of orthodoxy, rather than seeing it as something dusty and stale and old-fashioned that needs to be thrown out, to see it as, no, this is the fount. Go back to this fount and be refreshed, because this is what will get you through the next season.
Glory to God. And just once more then, Trevin, where can viewers or listeners find out more about you and your work then?
Well, they can go to if they go to trevinwax.com, it will take them to my column at the Gospel Coalition. I write there twice a week. I also have an email newsletter that you can find online, where I email out two times a week some different links and things that I found that have been helpful online. I try to curate really good content for people to be able to get in their email inboxes, and to also comment on some things that are going on in the world, or things that I've been reading, or things that I've been thinking about in terms of the church that I hope will be helpful. And then, of course, I'm on Twitter and Facebook and all the social media platforms, although I try to not spend too much time on those. As I've written about, we have to, have a balanced approach to them.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Trevin. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and God bless you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm glad to be with you.